Well, good morning, everyone. Brother Jackson, and glad to see you here with us today from Penn State. Um, Starting a series today on the last week of Jesus. I think I'll finish it by the end of next year, but this will be the first one. And why focus on this? Those 6 days, 7 days, are the most important week in the history of the most important man who ever lived. And his entire life and pre-life, for that matter, points to the events of this particular week, obviously culminating in the death, the burial, and the resurrection. Uh, we could write a PhD dissertation just on these chapters. Well, maybe I couldn't, but uh, some people could. Write a dissertation just on the events of this week, the last days of Jesus, the most important week of the most important man who ever lived. People make many things out of Jesus. They often want him to conform to their own image. Preparing the lesson, I flashed back to Durant, Mississippi in the 1950s, where my grandmother had a picture of Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, who they loved, and a picture of Jesus in air quotes. Now that Jesus had blonde hair about like Jodie's here, and blue eyes. And as a little kid, I kind of remember looking at it and thinking, boy, did he really look like that? But people make of Jesus, in many cases, what they want. Rather than conform to Jesus and his teachings, they want Jesus to conform to them. There's a story, and it's not my story, and I did tell Joe, and I hesitate to tell you. But there was a story that two men got in an argument about what Jesus looked like. Now, one of the men was a Caucasian. He was white. The other guy was black. And the white man just, you know, said up and down, Jesus was a white man. He's a Caucasian. And the black man said, oh, no, no. He was in that area of the world. He was obviously a black guy. Now, what I failed to tell you is when they did this argument, they were out in a rowboat, fishing, throwing the line in the water. Well, they argued and they argued and they argued, and finally it came to blows. They began fighting. The boat overturned and they drowned. So next they show up at the pearly gates, quote, and St. Peter, beats them and welcomes them in, and they said, but St. Peter, before we even go in here, give us the answer. Was Jesus white or was he black? And all of a sudden Jesus comes by and says, Buenos dias, amigos. So, you'll remember that. And the point of it is people want to make Jesus what they want him to be. We're going to see, and I can't even express it all, how complex of character Jesus is. And you could spend your days from this day forward and not completely understand all the aspects of Jesus. And it would be a great life study to simply attempt to do that. So today I want to somewhat set the context. We're going to be talking about the so-called triumphal entry into Jerusalem. Now, many times we'll get sermons, but they'll be somewhat isolated. Someone might preach a sermon on that, but often we feel like, well, he goes into Jerusalem, the next thing happens. He goes to the garden. I remember that, and he's praying there with the disciples, and the crowd comes and arrests him, and the next you go through these trials, and then he's eventually turned over and crucified. But there's so much more. This last week is just packed full of activity and of teaching, some of the most valuable teachings. And there's a tremendous tension in the week. And I want us to really understand the tension that is going on as this week begins. I've often been somewhat not stumped, but thinking about why didn't the apostles get it after all the teaching of 3 years and more? Why didn't they really fully understand that he was the Son of God in a spiritual kingdom, not there to set up a physical kingdom with all the trappings of a king and on the throne and people hurrying around to assist him and bowing down to him, etc. The apostles didn't get it, and Jesus told them they wouldn't get it. And I'm convinced I wouldn't have gotten it, because what happened with his crucifixion, death, burial, and resurrection was so out of the ordinary. You couldn't have conceived it in advance, even though he told them in so many words that it was going to occur. So I've often, in fact, until just recently, I've often thought, well, the Jews wanted a physical king because they had this great kingdom under Solomon. First under David, the warrior king, consolidated the area, defeated the enemies of Israel, and gave a peaceful kingdom over to Solomon for the most part. Solomon didn't, you don't read about the wars of Solomon. You read a lot about the battles and the wars of David. So Solomon was able to build his kingdom, build that great temple, build the palace for the king, accumulate tremendous wealth, even for that time, so that kings of other areas and the Queen of Sheba came to see Solomon's wealth and hear his wisdom, and goes away and says, the half has not been told. Imagine if you were a Jew living in that time around, say, 900 years BC or so, 900 years before Christ. You would have been king of the hill. You would have been living in peace. You would have been living in prosperity. And it would have really been great. So I've always thought, well, that's pretty much why the Jews wanted to restore the kingdom with a physical king. But there's another part of history that most of us are not as familiar with. I went over some of this on Friday with some of the people in our Luke class. So you who are in the Luke class can sleep during this portion, but do not snore and do not, irritate the people next to you. But from our history, we know that the last book of the Bible, we believe in Malachi, was written approximately 400 years before Christ. That's a long time, 4 centuries. In the United States term, that would take us all the way back to 1625, which would have been shortly after the Mayflower landed at Plymouth Rock. A long time. So there was no inspiration and no new books of the Old Covenant from Malachi again until Jesus comes on the scene and John the Baptist in the first century. That is a very long time. Well, history didn't just stand still at that time. There was a lot going on, and there was a lot going on in Israel, and a lot of that is recorded in the books of Maccabees. Now, the books of Maccabees are history. They're not inspired history, but they are very, very interesting and very difficult in some cases to slog through. And so I want to give you some of the highlights of what happened during that period, very, very high level. We know that when the Old Testament closed out in Malachi, the great kingdom of that time was still the Persian Empire. Now, between 400 BC and on into the 300s, there were wars, multiple wars, fought between the Persians and the Greeks. Those wars are still studied in military academies today. When I went back to school in the Air Force, we studied and read about the Peloponnesian Wars between Persia and Greece, and the Greece and Greek. So that occurred. Persia ruled the area of Israel, of Turkey, on into what had been the Babylonian kingdom of Iraq and Iran in modern day terms, and even on beyond that into an area called Parthia, which was all the way out toward India. Well, in a small area of Greece called Macedonia, which considered itself almost a separate province, a man by the name of Philip of Macedon arose, and he was a great warrior general. He was a warrior. So he had some success in fighting the enemies of Greece. But his son, young guy by the name of Alexander, who Philip thought was going to be kind of a wuss and not much of a fighter, Alexander grew up with a classical education, and in his teens, he began leading armies in the field. I'm talking 18, 19 years old. He was at the head of the armies. Well, when Philip died, Alexander took over, and he began the payback of Persia, because Persia had beaten up on the Greeks so much. So Alexander was a military genius for his day. His troops were well trained. They fought together with cavalry on the sides. He was just a military genius. So he crossed into Asia Minor, what we call modern day Turkey, came on down through Syria, fighting the Persians all the way, completely obliterated the Persians, went all the way into India and fought a battle there that was kind of a draw. So he comes back to Babylon and stays there. He's 33 years old, and he's defeated this entire Persian empire. He is the king of the hill at this point. Unfortunately, at age 33, he died. He left no heir. There was no son at the time. And so the kingdoms were divided up between four of his generals. Okay? So just remember, four generals. That's all prophesied in the book of Daniel, by the way, if you really get into it. So two of these generals are particularly important. One was Ptolemy, Ptolemy. Ptolemy took over Egypt, and he in about 300 BC, about 300 years before Christ, took over, and there was a succession of Ptolemies. Ptolemy the first, Ptolemy the second. Some of them were very good, some not so good. One of the Ptolemies in the middle of the 3rd century BC is the one that organized the Septuagint. He brought, by the history, 70 Jewish scholars into Alexandria, Egypt, and had them translate the Bible from Hebrew into Greek. Why Greek? Because Greek had become the international language. And why Greek? Because Alexander was Greek and loved all things Greek, art, literature, economics, and established that in all of these kingdoms where he went. So you got Ptolemy down here in Egypt. There's another general up here called Seleucus. He took over modern day Turkey and Syria. Now, what do you got in the middle? You got Egypt down here, Syria up here, and you got Israel right in the middle of the map. So Israel was trod upon back and forth for hundreds of years as the Egyptians now fought the Syrians, or the Seleucus army, and it was called the Seleucid Empire. Okay, Seleucid Empire in the north, and Ptolemaic empires in Egypt, Israel in the middle. Well, things rocked along pretty well for 100 years or so. The domination of Israel was primarily by the Syrians, the Seleucid Empire, and they pretty much allowed the Jews to worship as they would, continue circumcising their children, praying and sacrificing in the temple, etc. Then along comes a maniac by the name of Antiochus the Fourth. Thank you, Joe. Antiochus. Think of that name, Antioch. There were dozens of cities named after the Antiochs. Now he was the fourth one. Some of the earlier ones were actually good people. Antiochus the Fourth hated the Jews. He wanted them to disappear. So he, and through his minions coming in, they wanted to outlaw circumcision. They wanted to outlaw sacrifices in the temple, and it kept getting worse and worse and worse. He installed his own high priest in the Jewish worship. There were battles between the high priest. It was a mess. Well, a poor priest up in the hinterlands, up in the countryside, by the name of Mattathias, objected this. The Syrians had sent people out to get these Jewish people in the countryside to go Greek. In other words, to start sacrificing to Greek gods and so on. Mattathias was a poor priest with 5 sons. Mattathias says, not on my watch. We're not giving in. So when the representative of the Syrians come in to make Mattathias sacrifice to the gods, one of his sons raises up and they kill this rep of the Syrians. So the war was on. Mattathias, his sons, and some followers flee to the hills. When was this? This is about 165 BC. roughly 165 years, about the time of the Civil War, if you go back that long in the United States. So Mattathias and his sons flee into the hills. They fought a 6 or 7 year long guerrilla battle with the Syrians, back and forth, back and forth. And finally, the Syrians get so tired of it, kind of like the Americans did in Vietnam, they pull out. And guess what? Now Israel was an independent state, a nation, for roughly 80 years. They had their own king. They restored the temple. And as an aside, when they restored the temple, they had to clean it out because a pig had been sacrificed in the temple, totally polluting it. So when they went in to clean it out, they had the candlesticks there. They only had oil for one night to keep it running. Miraculously, in their view, the candlesticks kept going for 8 days. That's the origin of Hanukkah, the celebration that Jews, a very high celebration that the Jews do every year. So at any rate, now Israel was an independent nation for about 80 years. They could restore their worship, things were good, and then the Romans came back in. In 63 BC, Pompey, a Roman general of that day, comes in, takes over Israel and Jerusalem again. He later, by the way, became emperor. So from 63 on, Israel was again a subservient state of Rome. This explains why they hated the Romans. They hated the taxation. They hated the observation that the Romans did. Rome had a vast empire, many, many nations, dozens of nations. But the worst one they had in terms of keeping them in line was Israel. And so Rome eventually built a huge barracks right off of the temple grounds that would house at least 100 Roman soldiers and kept them there all the time during Jesus's days. So this explains two things: why the Jewish people most often hated the Roman people, or the Roman Empire, and particularly hated tax collectors, because the tax collectors were collecting taxes for this, in their view, corrupt and overbearing Roman government. One of Jesus's apostles was Matthew, also known as Levi, a tax collector. He would have had one of 4 franchises. Kind of think McDonald's. So he would have had the northern franchise on the trade routes where all the camels and donkeys came down, and they collected all kinds of taxes. They would collect a body tax. If you were breathing, you had to pay a tax. They would collect a tax for each animal they brought through. They taxed each wheel of a cart or a wagon. So 2-wheel carts became very popular rather than the 4-wheel cart. I guess if you could push a wheelbarrow, you'd only have the 1 wheel. So they literally taxed everything, and the Jewish people hated them and hated the tax collectors. And oh, by the way, the vast majority of the tax collectors were corrupt, because Rome would say, in this area, all you got to collect, hypothesize, is $1 million this year. So they would go out, if they collected 2 million, they kept the rest of it. They only had to give the Romans the million. And this is before, computers and high math. It was all just, not as organized as you might think. And so these tax collectors got very, very, very rich. So that was the environment that Jesus came into. A Jewish nation that was, by and large, fed up with Roman rule. They wanted a physical king to regain their independence from the time of the Maccabean uprising, but of course, looking all the way back to the kingdom of Solomon and David before him. So with that, I want to read some of the initial scriptures that talk about the entrance of Jesus into Jerusalem. And I've given you a paper there with the references. I won't be going through all of those. But I would like Josh, if you would go ahead with your Bible and open to Matthew 20. I'll ask you to read that shortly. And Phil, if you would open up to John chapter 12 and have that ready. I'll give you the verses here in a moment. So Matthew 20 for Josh, John 12 for Phil. Thank you. First thing we want to remember here is that this last week of Jesus' life comes after approximately 3 to 3.5 years of his time in the ministry, so to speak. He was about 30 years old when he first appeared on the scene. Was baptized by John the Baptist in the Jordan River. When I say 3 to 3.5, Bible experts actually disagree on that. It depends on one of the feast days that he went to, and whether it was the same as another feast day. And I won't get into how complicated it is. So 3 to 3.5 years. The first year or two, emphasized his healings. Now, he taught, but the emphasis was on the healings. Now, why? Because he was showing by his power, stilling the waters, turning the bread into feeding 5,000 and 4,000, raising the dead. He was showing over and over again his power, that only someone divine could have that power over the forces of nature. Even then, people who saw those miracles, many believed, but many attributed it to what? Magic or to the devil. Remember, they said he cast out demons by the power of the demon. And Jesus says a house divided itself cannot stand. In other words, how stupid would it be to get power from the devil to cast out the devils out of other people? But those early years were largely the healings. The later years emphasized the parables, the teachings, and the preparation of the apostles. Why? Because Jesus is going to the cross. He's going to be leaving the world, this physical world, and the apostles are going to be the nucleus of the church. They're going to give the ability to bind and loose through the power of the Holy Spirit. So Jesus, what we want to understand this, and this, if you ever have trouble doubting, you have to answer the question: how was all of this predicted and prophesied in such a minute form, years in some cases before it actually happened? So we see that he predicted all of what was going to occur. In Matthew 16, I'll read this. The first part of that deals with, the middle part of it deals with Peter's confession of Jesus being the Christ. Mike mentioned that in his comments today, where Jesus basically says, who are the folks men say that I am? Who are they saying they are? Well, some say you're Elijah, some say you're Jeremiah, which meant they would have had to come back to life, or one of the other prophets. And Jesus says, well, who do you say I am? I think he addressed that to all the apostles. Peter, always the first one to speak up. He had trouble sitting in his seat in the third grade too. I couldn't tell Peter. I didn't. Okay. I don't know where I'm going with that. Peter. So Peter jumps up and says, "You're the Christ," and that means the anointed one, the King. You're the Christ, the Son of God. He is acknowledging Jesus' divinity. And Jesus accepted that. And as Mike pointed out, Jesus said, it's by your Father in heaven that's been revealed to you. Yes, it is true. But then he told them to go out and tell no one. Why? Because Jesus knows what's going to happen. If he starts telling people that he is the anointed king, there can be no king but Caesar in the Roman Empire. Caesar they didn't call him a king, but he was a king. He was the ruler. And in the Roman Empire, Caesar is number one, numero uno. You can't have two numero unos. You can't have Caesar over here and then Jesus being a king too. So at this point, Jesus' time had not yet come, and he told them to go out and tell no one. But then I'm going to read from verse 21 of Matthew 16. This is after Peter's confession. From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem, Jesus, and suffer many things from the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed. We're going to see, probably in July when I teach my next one, we're going to see there's like an unholy alliance between the Pharisees and Sadducees that they unite in wanting to kill Jesus. They're very different in their religious views and in their wealth of the Sadducees and so. But they get together in this last week to finally arrest Jesus and have him killed. So he says the chief priests and scribes and be killed and be raised up on the third day. He's telling them, just I mean, as plain as he could be. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, "God forbid it, Lord! This shall never happen to you." Good old Peter, man. But he, that is Jesus, turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me, for you're not setting your mind on God's interest, but man's." Do we ever do that? Do we set our mind on our interest and not the simple expression that Jesus said? Jesus said, "This is going to happen. They're going to take me in Jerusalem. They're going to kill me. I'm going to be raised again on the third day." No, no, you can't do it. Get behind me. You're not going to stop it. There's another reference in Mark 8. In the interest of time, maybe I'll read that in July, but not today. But then Jesus, after the transfiguration, you remember he goes on the mountain, he's transfigured. Moses and Elijah appear with him. And go back and read it when you can. They're discussing what's going to happen in Jerusalem. Wouldn't you have loved to have that on video today with your cell phone or whatever? So Jesus again tells them in Matthew 17 verses, I'm sorry, Matthew 20, no, Matthew 17, my bad, verse 19, and I'll just read verse 22. And while they were gathering together in Galilee, Jesus said to them, "The Son of Man," and that's what he called himself mostly, as Mike pointed out, "Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. They will kill him. He will be raised on the third day." And they were deeply grieved. They're arguing from a physical. You can't do this. You cannot go down there and let them kill you. Think of this, though. You and I and all other humans that have been born, they will die unless the Lord comes first. But we're not born to die. We will die because of the sin of Adam. But we're born to live. We're born to use our talent, our minds, our charity, our benevolence to help the world, to follow Christ. But Jesus was the only one who's born to die. His mission at birth was to die for the sins of the world. And he knew that certainly early on, as soon as he, knew himself as as an adult. And he was telling them plainly, this is going to happen. And they didn't get it. John repeatedly refers to the hour that he will be lifted up. So Phil, chapter 12 of John, and I'd like, if you would, to read verse 20 all the way through 33.
John 12, verse 20. Now among those who went up to worship at the feast were some Greeks. So these came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, and asked him, "Sir, we wish to see Jesus." Philip went and told Andrew. Andrew and Philip went and told Jesus. And Jesus answered them, "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Whoever loves his life loses it, and whoever hates his life in this world will keep it for eternal life. If anyone serves me, he must follow me, and where I am, there will my servant be also. If anyone serves me, the Father will honor him. Now is my soul troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? But for this purpose I have come to this hour. Father, glorify your name. Then a voice came from heaven. I have glorified it, and I will glorify it again. The crowd that stood there and heard it said that it had thundered. Others said, an angel has spoken to him. Jesus answered, this voice has come for your sake, not mine. Now is the judgment of this world. Now will the ruler of this world be cast out. And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself. He said this to show by what kind of death he was going to die.
Yeah, he is alluding to the cross here. They may not have immediately made that, but for our sake, the theology is he was going to be lifted up for the sins of you and me and of all people. So now I want us to understand the tension that's going into this week. And if you turn to John chapter 11, this is great background for what Jesus is, you could say, walking into. Now, this has occurred right after the death and the return to life of Lazarus. We know that story. Lazarus had the two sisters, Mary and Martha. They seemed to be just friends with Jesus. Jesus would go and stay with them. Lazarus died. Some of the disciples went and told Jesus. He purposely waited to 3 days or so after the death, comes and raises Lazarus from the dead. Was it a resurrection? Yes, but Lazarus was raised to die again. The difference is Jesus is resurrected never to die again physically. And in that resurrection, he was glorified again, as we just talked about in John 12. So read with me in John 11, verse 45. This is right after the raising of Lazarus. Now, therefore, many of the Jews who came to Mary and saw what he had done believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them the things which Jesus had done. You see the dichotomy? People saw the same thing. They saw the raising of Lazarus. Some believed that this is miraculous. And then others go and tell the rulers. Therefore, continuing verse 47, therefore the chief priests and the Pharisees, now remember the chief priests in Jerusalem were largely Sadducees, not 100%, but largely. So the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered the Sanhedrin, that's the 70, that's the top dogs, that's the council it's referred to. Actually, scholars believe it goes back to the 70 that Moses got to be as advisors upon the advice of his father-in-law. But so they gathered the Sanhedrin. This is the council, and we're saying, what are we doing? For this man is doing many signs. They couldn't deny him. If we let him go on like this, all will believe in him. And the Romans, read it carefully, the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. In other words, my job is being threatened here. The nation, if we've got somebody claiming to be a king with miracles, then we're in danger of the Romans coming in and taking up not only our place, but also subjecting the nation to even greater control. Verse 49, but one of them, Caiaphas, and that's a high priest that Jesus will also go before, who was high priest that year, said to them, you know nothing at all. In other words, you're clueless, we would say, nor do you take into account that it is better for you that one man should die for the people and that the whole nation not perish. In other words, away with this guy. We'll get rid of him. It'll be done, and the nation will not suffer. Now, he did not say this from himself, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus was going to die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but in order that he might also gather together into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. So from that day on, they planned together to kill him. So right now, as Jesus is getting ready to go into Jerusalem, the chief priests have joined with the Pharisees, and they've got it out for Jesus. They want to kill him. They don't know how yet. They don't know exactly when, but they know that it's danger because the crowds are huge. And the one thing that the Romans will always enforce is peace, pax romana. And if you've got a crowd, then you have the potential for a riot. If the riot comes, Rome's going to come in with their soldiers. So we see from this, many believed in him, some alerted the leaders. His enemies wanted to kill him, but they feared the crowds because the crowds were huge at this point. Jesus had a tremendous following. And remember, it's the Passover week. Just as an aside, remember that Passover as a festival was a 7-day feast. The Passover day was one day of that Passover feast, the 7 days. So people crowded into Jerusalem for the Passover. So therefore, Jesus goes out to spend some time in the wilderness and no doubt in the Garden of Gethsemane. So now we get the actual triumphal entry from Matthew 21, 1 through 11. And I'm going to read that fairly quickly here. There's some great references to from the Old Testament that we'll point out here. And when they had approached Jerusalem and came to Bethphage at the Mount of Olives, which is just across the little creek from Jerusalem, Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, "Go into the village opposite you, and immediately you'll find a donkey tied there and a colt with her. Untie them and bring them to me. And if anyone says anything to you, you shall say, 'The Lord has need of them,' and immediately he'll send them." And this took place in order that what was spoken through the prophet would be fulfilled, saying, and this is 2 prophecies really from Isaiah 62 and Zechariah 9:9. They're fused. "Say to the daughter of Zion, behold, your king is coming to you, lowly and mounted on a donkey, and on a colt, the foal of a pack animal." And the disciples went and did just as Jesus had instructed them, and brought the donkey and the colt and laid their garments on them. Notice what they did. The same disciples went and got the donkey, and they laid their jackets or their cloaks on the donkey, that kind of as a saddle. And most of the crowd spread their garments in the road as an act of homage or worship and sacrifice. We don't know if they got their clothes back or in what condition it would have been. And others were cutting branches from the trees and spreading them in the road. As an aside, this is how some churches get Palm Sunday, right here, that Jesus came into Jerusalem on a Sunday, and that they spread the palm trees on it, and so they celebrate that as the first of the Holy Week. And most of the crowd spread their garments from the trees, spreading them in the road. The crowds going ahead of him and those who were following were crying out, saying, "Hosanna to the Son of David! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord! Hosanna in the highest." The most common interpretation of Hosanna is save us or God save us. And this is, I believe, a clear reference to, again, these Old Testament prophecies. And when he entered Jerusalem, all the city was stirred, saying, "Who is this?" And the crowds were saying, now the crowds come in, "This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth in Galilee." So we see the symbolic theology here. Entering the beast is a reference to Zechariah and Isaiah, denoting the kingship, the king coming. His predicting the details, which we've seen in multiple occasions, shows him to be a prophet. And his oversight of the temple shows him to be the priest. And also the book of Hebrews develops the theology of Jesus as being the high priest. Here's a little factoid that I had never really ever put together. But go over to Mark 11. Mark 11:11. It seems from Matthew that Jesus rides into the city and then just goes out and goes back to Bethany. But Mark 11:11 gives a slightly little different detail, which is really interesting, if I could find it. That's in the New Testament. All right, 11:11, and this is Mark's account of Jesus coming in the same thing. Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And he adds verse 10, blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. Hosanna in the highest. Verse 11, interesting. Jesus entered Jerusalem and came into the temple that same day. And after looking around at everything, he left for Bethany with the 12 since it was already late. A little detail, but you can just see he knows he's omniscient, but he wants to see these money changers and these booths. It's the next day that he comes by and cleans it out, and he calls it, the den of robbers, and overturns the table and all. So we see Jesus, king, prophet, and priest. We've seen the crowds welcoming him. Now we see that the Pharisees are very upset. The Pharisees, were the top dogs, particularly out in the rural areas. They ran the synagogues. They decreed what was right, like the Sabbath day's journey and all of those kinds of things. So in Luke 39, and I'm moving toward the end here. Not 39, Luke 19, I'm sorry. I'm going too far. Luke 19, verse 39. We have after the entry, we have in verse 39, some of the Pharisees in the crowd. They're in the crowd. They're watching the entry. They said to him, "Teacher, rebuke your disciples." See, they understood what the crowd was saying. They understood that the crowd was recognizing Jesus as this prophetic king, prophesied king from the Old Testament. But Jesus answered and said, "I'll tell you, if these were silent, the stones would cry out." Would have been the first rock concert. Sorry. Later on, the stones do cry out in a sense. The Rolling Stone comes away from the tomb when Jesus is resurrected. Graves are opened upon his death. People come out of those tombs. But basically what he's saying is, you can't shut this crowd up. If they were to be quiet, even nature, would sing the praises of Jesus. The Pharisees are upset. They very likely repeatedly tried to shut things down. They were not happy. They want to quiet the crowd. And these are Old Testament allusions to the stones in Habakkuk 2. In Habakkuk 2, Habakkuk is like criticizing Jews who had idols of stone, saying the stones are mute, they can't speak, and so on. But the prophecy is, at some point the stones will cry out, and that's taken as a prophecy reference to this. The apostles still didn't get it yet. John 12:16, all would not be clear until he was glorified. The last glorification is that resurrection. Jesus, what Paul would say, is declared to be the Son of God. What? By the resurrection. Now we can say, well, what about his miracles? Great. What about his teachings? Nothing ever like it. But to be resurrected, never to die again, that was the final glorification. And then, of course, Jesus goes into heaven and sits upon the right hand of God. In John 13:7, Jesus even told them that they would get it later. So I'm not as hard on the apostles now as I might have been, I don't know, 2 weeks ago. I'm not sure I would have gotten it. Probably wouldn't have. I have a great 8th grade education, but Jesus answered and said to Simon Peter, "What I am doing, you do not realize now, but you will understand it afterwards." See, Jesus even cuts them slack, because they keep asking, don't go to Jerusalem. And he's saying, that is my mission, to go and to die. No, don't go. And he tells them they'll get it later. They needed the full complex picture to understand it. Last page, applications. Jesus is complex. Don't simplify him into our image. Let's spend the rest of our days, few or many, just trying to really get into the life of Jesus and just understand his views, his humanity, his his anger when it was justified and righteous, but also his sympathy and his empathy, and particularly for the downtrodden. That's one thing we've seen from our study of Luke. That the woman at the well that had been married so many times, the woman they brought to him to stone because she'd been taken in adultery. He had pity upon them. Now he didn't allow them to continue in sin, but he had pity on the people, the downtrodden. Don't trust fickle crowds. I've been in a few, and they are fickle. God alone is trustworthy. Some of these same people that are saying, "Oh, Hosanna," will in a short time be saying, "Crucify him, crucify him." They got some fake news from the hierarchy of the Jews. Make sacrifices that honor his example. The Hebrew writer, present yourself a living sacrifice. Our bodies even says as a living sacrifice. Don't cut off our fingers and hands and do that, but make the life itself the sacrifice. Our time, our talents, yes, our money, a gentle word at a right time. Share his desire for peace and model his humanity. Enthusiasm is fantastic. And believe it or not, I can remember many decades ago at the age of 12 when I was baptized. I was on a high. And my dad, who was not a Christian, I remember going home and saying, and my mother actually said, "Well, Al was baptized tonight." And my dad said, That's what he said. Like, no big deal. He was a good man. Worked hard, brought home his money, but he was not a Christian until much later. And he was baptized at around 70 years old. More than enthusiasm, be committed for the long haul, whether it be few or many days, a lifetime, short or long, of serving him. A fantastic week, chock full of valuable things in the life of the most important man who ever lived. And I hope we both enjoyed and got something out of it today. Thanks for attention.